can't you take your mind off French women?
Not when you keep reminding me of a French woman.
Gentlemen, get the thing straight once and for all. The policeman isn't there to create disorder. The policeman is there to preserve disorder.
Ross Alhambra intersection at 15000. Contact Los Angeles Center, 2 minutes northeast of the stadium intersection. Expect further clearance no later than 09er 52 Greenwich.
Do it once, do it twice, do it over again.
Not too many times.
Hello, friends. Sean here with episode 4 of my weird record collection. Today, I will present to you the wit and wisdom of the husband and wife team of Gaynor and Dorothy Maddox, courtesy of an album called Hear How to Plan the Perfect Dinner Party. But before we dive into that record, I just had a comment or two about the previous episode in which I talked about those auto harp records. Friends, upon listening to that finished version of episode 3, I realized that I made a few factual errors and omissions, and also I acquired yet another record that really belongs in the same discussion. I have too much to say just to insert into this particular episode right now, but not enough for a full-blown episode, so sometime in the near future, I'm going to release an interim mini episode to cover the updates to the auto harp episode. Now that I got that out of the way, let's hear how to plan the perfect dinner party. Before we get into the record, though, let's talk about its record label, the Carlton Record Corporation. Joe Carlton was a former A&R guy from RCA Records, and he started the Carlton Record Corporation in October 1957 at 157 West 57th Street in New York City, just 2 blocks south of Central Park. The label's first single was a doo-wop song, The Prince of Players, backed with I'm Not Pretending, by Tommy Frederick and the High Notes.
Who sets the stage every opening day? Who made us all actors in his play?
Another early single on the Carlton label was That Crazy Feeling by a Texan named Kenneth Rogers.
It's not just the way you say hello whenever we should meet. Keeps my heart pounding like the ocean of the deep.
Yep, that Kenny Rogers. Another Carlton name that might sound familiar is Jimmy Seals, who would later become half of Seals and Crofts. Those were the typical kinds of records that Carlton would put out. Doo-wop, country, and other forms of popular music. Seemingly, most of the label's recording artists are pretty obscure today, but among its more known acts were Paul Evans, Jack Scott, and the controversial Anita Bryant. Merv Griffin also had a few easy listening records on that label. The Carlton label had a short-lived spin-off called Guaranteed. The address printed on the Guaranteed record label was 345 West 58th Street, just 2 blocks west of Carlton's address. The building at that address, currently known as the Coliseum Park Apartments, was built in 1957 as a co-op. That the address on the Guaranteed label is a residential address and not Carlton Records' address tells me that, for one thing, it might have been Joe Carlton's home address, and another, that address might have been used to possibly not make it obvious to, say, radio programmers that Guaranteed was actually part of Carlton Records and ergo would have a better chance of filling the airwaves. You see, radio stations did not like to put too many records of the same label too close together in their programming, or else it might look like, say, there was payola involved. That's why many record labels had several spin-off labels. Motown, for example, had Gordy, Tamla, and a couple of others I can't think of right now. VJ Records had Tolly and a couple of others I can't think of right now. Anyway, speaking of Guaranteed records, fun fact, among my late father's singles collection is a copy of Paul Evans performing Midnight Special, backed with Since I Met You, Baby, on Guaranteed Records from 1960. As for Carlton Records, well, they went bankrupt in early 1964 But as the record company disappeared, sadly, so did its master tapes, which were believed to be in absolute perfect condition and included many stereo recordings, which in those days was not yet common. Anita Bryant's master tapes, however, were reportedly sold to Columbia Records, where Joe Carlton would eventually work. And this, by the way, is why I believe so strongly in preservation, and why the records that I talk about, I make sure they're available somewhere so that people can listen to them. Reissues of most of Carlton's artists are most likely sourced from vinyl because, well, the master tapes no longer exist. Again, the company is said to also have some really good stereo recordings, but most, if not all, of the reissues since have been mono only. Getting back to Joe Carlton, after his label folded, he worked at ABC Paramount Records as vice president of its spin-off label Probe Records. In 1968, he became president of yet another ABC Paramount offshoot, Command Records, which was founded by musician Enoch Light in 1959. Fun fact about Command Records, by the way, instead of using magnetic tape like most people did to master the recordings, they actually recorded onto 35mm film. There are a couple of reasons. For one, because the 35mm film was wider than recording tape, you could fit more than 3 tracks on it. Also, you remember looking at those films you would see in school and how there'd be those little holes, those perforations in the sides? Well, that was basically to align with the mechanisms in the projector. It would keep the film from wobbling back and forth. That was another reason Enoch Light wanted to use film instead of tape. That way, without the film wobbling back and forth, there was much less of a chance of wow and flutter. That's a phenomenon I talked about in the previous episode. Now, ABC Records eventually moved to Los Angeles, but Joe decided he was going to stay in New York, so he had to resign. He co-founded Organic Productions in late 1970 with Howard Richman. Organic Productions was kind of a TV and music production company. They were looking for the most innovative ways to bring music and TV to consumers. By the end of the decade, Joe found himself at Almo Music. That's all I could find out about Joe Carlton and the Carlton Record Corporation, much of which came from the Both Sides Now publications website from the Carlton discography compiled by Mike Callahan and David Edwards. You will find a link to that site in the show notes for this episode at myweirdrecords.fab4it.com. But one thing that Carlton may have pioneered, actually, was the Do-It-Yourself record with its Hear How series. And there's quite a variety of titles in that series, including, but not limited to, Hear How You Can Feel Fit All Day, Hear How to Touch Type, Hear How to Be a Better Bowler, Hear How to Skin Dive, featuring Lloyd Bridges, by the way, Hear How to Train Your Dog, Hear How to Tell Your Children the Facts of Life, Hear How to Achieve Sexual Harmony in Marriage. Spoiler alert, this podcast will feature at least one more Hear How record in a future episode. But for now, let's talk about this episode's featured album, Hear How to Plan the Perfect Dinner Party. Hear How to Plan the Perfect Dinner Party was recorded and released most likely in 1960. At least Discogs.com says 1960, and the etching in the runout groove on my copy at least has a date of August 1st, 1960. But the Carlton album discography, to which I'll refer later, says it's from 1961. Whatever the case, the record was pressed by Allentown Record Company Incorporated of Allentown, Pennsylvania. How do I know that? Again, by the runout etchings. Allentown Record Company tends to put ARC and then a date in the runout groove, so that's a fun fact for you. Now, I don't know about all of the Hear How series, and I know this is not true of all of the Carlton Record Company's albums, but this copy that I own of Hear How to Plan the Perfect Dinner Party is not actually a vinyl record, it is a polystyrene record. I find that a little bit unusual because when you encounter a polystyrene record, it's usually a 7-inch single. A lot of them from the 70s are like that. but I'm pretty sure that this album is pressed on styrene. You can kind of tell if you listen really carefully to how the record sounds just by handling it. I don't know if you can really hear this, but right now, I'm just kind of futzing around with a 12-inch vinyl record, a typical vinyl record. Like, here's how it sounds if I rub my thumb on the outer edge of it. Being careful not to touch the playing surface, of course. And here is the record that How to Plan the Perfect Dinner Party is pressed on. See, vinyl records don't make that sound. So, yeah, that's interesting that they used this material to press it on. I'll get back to that a little bit later. But while I have the record out of its jacket, I'm noticing that the record label does not say, "Hear how to plan the perfect dinner party." Instead, it says, "Hear how to become a perfect dinner party hostess." I have a feeling that that was the working title of the album, and the labels might have been made before the album was actually recorded, because not only are the narrators husband and wife, but they both seem to share equal responsibility in talking about how to prepare the meals. So it's not how to be a perfect hostess. It's just how to put a dinner party on, period. There's nothing in the audio content that implies that the record is specifically made for women. And indeed, the cover photo shows two couples sitting at a dining table with another couple standing behind the table, implying that that standing couple are co-hosting the party. There are 4 bands on the record, 2 per side, with a grand total of about 40 minutes of playing time. Each band corresponds to a particular dinner menu. On side 1, you learn how to make a steak dinner and a Polynesian dinner. Side 2 will tell you how to prepare French cuisine and chicken dinner. I like to get a little bit of background on the makers of these weird records that I talk about, but unfortunately I was not able to get a heck of a lot of information about Gaynor and Dorothy. You'd be amazed at how many hits you get, for example, when you Google the name Gaynor Maddox, even in quotation marks. It's astonishing how many people have the name Gaynor Maddox, and every single one that I found, except for the Gaynor Maddox on this record, was a woman. But I'll share with you what I was able to find out. Again, it's not much, but it's something. Gaynor Maddox was born in San Diego. I'll share my thoughts about this a little later. On June 12, 1894, and he was the son of William Theobald and Clara Gertrude Maddox. Now, if what I'm about to say sounds very scripted and that I'm reading from a script, I got news for you, I am. As a food and markets editor for Newspaper Enterprise Association, Gaynor was apparently a well-known writer whose column featured a recurring commentary about food. He must have also been a regular radio commentator, and as such, I was able to locate a story he read on the air in 1946, and I will link that recording in this episode's show notes at myweirdrecords.fab4it.com. Perhaps a claim to fame, if you can call it a claim to fame, is that Gaynor predicted the post-war European wheat crisis of 1946. Also, I was able to find a photo of him from 1955 in which he's supervising cartons of oranges being loaded into what's called a reefer truck, and I will be happy to link that in the show notes as well. And it looks like it's for sale. You can buy it. And unlike other things I've been talking about in previous episodes, I do not get a cut of the sale if you buy it. But anyway, Gaynor, in addition to his newspaper columns, also authored several books, including but not limited to The Safe and Sure Way to Reduce, Food and Arthritis, and Cookbook for Diabetics. It seems to me that judging by other book titles he had, that Gaynor was kind of into cooking as healthily as possible. As for his wife, Dorothy L. Maddox, well, she was born to Samuel Manson and Sadie Manson Mann in Rochester, New York on July 16, 1905. As with Gaynor, she also worked for Newspaper Enterprise Association and wrote food columns, often credited not as Dorothy Maddox, but Mrs. Gaynor Maddox. Now, what little I could find out about Gaynor, I could find even less about Dorothy. Apparently before Gaynor, she was married to Edwin Godfrey Strauss and had a son with him named Robert. But together, Dorothy and Gaynor were the parents to the late Patrick Gaynor Maddox and at least one other child whose name and gender I could not ascertain. Gaynor died in New York City on February 1st, 1985. I have no idea whatever became of Dorothy, but I'm going to assume that she too has passed on, or else she'd be 118 years old at the time of this recording. Not impossible, but also not likely. Listening to the record, I found that Gaynor and Dorothy both sounded like experts in the world of cooking, or at least they sounded very confident in what they were talking about. And if you heard episode 3 of this podcast, you might remember that I observed regional speech patterns in the auto harp records. Well, I noticed a hint of a mid-Atlantic accent in Gaynor's voice, which I found odd given that he was born in San Diego. Then again, I don't know where he lived most of his life. He might have spent his formative years on the East Coast. But I couldn't help but notice how he had that classic mid-Atlantic accent with the slightly dropped R sounds. For example, he would say "color" instead of "color."
And that fresh vegetable platter that looks like an artist's palette with its vigorous outdoor color.
His pronunciation of deluxe is kind of Latinized. He says deluxe instead of deluxe.
Actually quite deluxe in a nice, neighborly American way.
And it just might be my pickiness, but as I listen to this, I can't help but notice and somewhat cringe at how both Gaynor and Dorothy pronounce casserole as casserole. I mean, I don't know about you, but a double S to me is an S sound, with maybe the exception of scissors, but
Now on with the dinner. Bring on that casserole of macaroni.
Well, that's really a lordly dish. Use a 2.5-quart casserole for 1 pound of macaroni.
But as you listen to the record, it becomes very apparent that Dorothy and Gaynor are reading from a script, especially with Gaynor's slight lack of conversational inflection. Yes, I said that I read from a script too, but at least I know how to inflect, you know? Anyway, sorry. At one point, you can even hear the page turn.
Vive la France, but settle for your local bake shop.
You're becoming poetical.
And I gotta tell you, despite the obviously scripted dialogue, it is a hoot. The two of them get very snarky, sometimes perhaps even risque, at least for 1960.
Did you know lots of French girls before you married me?
I'll tell you about that after the guests go home.
Promise?
And they even make comments that today could be considered pretty sexist.
Are you doubting my skill with a skillet?
I'm not doubting anything. Don't be so feminine.
Frenchmen prefer feminine women.
So do I. That's why I don't want you to get hot and bothered making crepe Suzette at your own dinner party. It's too tricky, too much business while you're supposed to be relaxed and lovely.
Even though the title of the record mentions hosting a dinner party, the dialogue focuses almost exclusively on the food rather than how to, say, entertain your guests. So let's go through each track of the record and get a feel for what they have to say about the 4 types of meals. The first meal, a charcoal steak dinner for 6, is apparently Dorothy's steak specialty. Now, I may have heard the record wrong, but I don't think I did. But, I listened to it all the way through multiple times just to prep for this episode, not counting the number of times I listened to it before I even considered doing this podcast. But I think it is implied, if not explicitly stated, that you do the charcoal cooking inside.
I can broil a steak outdoors over charcoal, but your steak cooked in an iron pan on top of the stove, sure it's magic. No one believes it. I mean till they taste it. A charcoal broiled steak in a little old pan.
Giving him credit, Gaynor emphasizes the importance of making sure that it's cooked in a very well-ventilated area.
Let's add a little warning. In a well-ventilated, smoke-free room, remember. Before you start pan broiling, make certain your kitchen is perfectly ventilated, either with a mechanical ventilator or strong coarse currents. The steak will smoke like any other meat cooked over charcoal. So be forewarned. Have a perfect ventilation system in your kitchen. No guests like to sing "Smoke Gets in Your Eyes" while eating.
Nowadays, there is a word for cooking charcoal in a well-ventilated area. That word, outside. Cooking indoors with charcoal can put you in extreme danger of carbon monoxide poisoning. But hey, Gaynor says to charcoal broil it on a stove in a heavy iron pan, so charcoal broil that thing in a stove in a heavy iron pan. Do what you want. I take no responsibility for any illnesses that might befall you thanks to Gaynor Maddox. Also part of this dinner is Ruth Patterson's North Carolina macaroni and cheese, and the recipe is printed on the back cover. Who Ruth Patterson is, well, Unfortunately, I was not able to find out. Now, friends, just in this opening cut on the album, the discussion of steak dinner, there are two things that happened that gave me tremendous respect for Gaynor Maddox and for Dorothy Maddox. First of all, listen to how Dorothy Maddox pronounces a certain frozen dessert.
Thinking of the raspberries over lemon sherbet we'll have for dessert.
Did you hear that?
You can get excellent fruit sherbets in the supermarkets these days.
Here, let's listen again.
Sherbet,
And one more time for good measure.
sherbet,
Sherbet, sherbet.
sherbet.
Because it is a sure bet that Sherbert is incorrect. But having said that, friends, I just can't win. You know why? Because on the back of the record cover, in the menu listing for steak dinner, it lists raspberries over lemon sherbet. Oh, you know what'll make up for that? Gaynor, God bless him. Listen to how he reacts to the suggestion that maybe somebody is going to want well-done steak.
Cook for 10 minutes on one side, then turn and cook on other side until it is right for your guests. Very rare, medium, or even well done if some of them like it that way.
Oh, no, not well done, please.
Remember, you're the host. A good host caters to each guest even though he doesn't like his taste.
Even so, not well done, please. Give him pot roast instead.
Gaynor, you were doing the Lord's work. Next on the album is a Polynesian dinner that involves chicken livers, water chestnuts, shrimp, coconuts, chicken momi, pineapple, curry, and poo-poo platter. This one has quite a lot of sexist humor about Hawaiian women. Lots of references to hula dancing and other Hawaiian stereotypes.
I like the chicken better than the genuine Hawaiian curry sauce.
The one with coconut your old Hawaiian friend taught you?
My old Hawaiian friend, yes. She was a very large woman and wore a flowing gown and was never without a flower in her hair. You see, I don't want my lovely wife to get overtired or frantic. You must greet the guests smiling and relaxed, like a hula dancer.
And I put here in my notes, ew, onions. Yeah, because I think most of these recipes call for onions. I cannot tolerate onions. I even have a physical intolerance to onions. But upon listening to the discussion of Polynesian dinner, it makes me realize how close Hawaiian cuisine is to your typical American Chinese cuisine because it uses soy sauce, duck sauce, water chestnuts, and I know bean sprouts happen somewhere, if not on this track, then another track on the album. What I did find interesting in the back and forth dialogue between Gaynor and Dorothy is that there is a little bit of emphasis on placing the guest's preferences over the host's preferences, which I kind of like. And that's the end of side one. And you flip the record over to side two, and the first track you hear is How to Prepare a French Dinner. Now, if the Polynesian dinner discussion was a little bit sexist, well, the French dinner discussion was a little bit condescending towards American chefs.
French chefs seem to be born with a sixth sense about their food, almost inspired. Very few American cooks can match them at their own game.
And something interesting is that Dorothy suggests cooking rock lobster bordelaise. She suggests it immediately as if she knows what to expect. But then when Gaynor explains what is entailed in a rock lobster bordelaise, Dorothy sounds surprised, as if blindsided. I don't know why she would have suggested something she had no idea what she was talking about. So anyway, interesting point of the discussion here is that Gaynor recalled a trip that they went on to Bordeaux, and they found out that crawfish was a preferred ingredient in French cuisine, except that chefs were finding crawfish too complicated to work with, so they switched to lobster. Going back to American chefs, later on, there's a mention that the recipe is not the original recipe as it's made in France, but adapted for American cooks. I don't think that was meant to be condescending, but that particular remark there was just made to say, hey, some of these ingredients might not be available in France, so we'll substitute them with what you can get as close as possible here in America, or might be something like that, but I don't think it was meant to be condescending in that regard. The fourth and final band on the album, side two, is A Chicken Dinner. And this track gets a little bit interesting because of some back and forth that goes on between Gaynor and Dorothy.
I'll do it any way you want. My one purpose in life is to please you.
And also, Gaynor refers to the chicken dinner with tarragon and white wine as feminine. I don't know what he means by that.
You know something? It's really a very feminine dish. Beguiling, subtle, and sustaining.
But it sounds a little sexist to me. I don't know. But turnabout is fair play, because for dessert, they talk about making flaming bananas, banana flambe with vanilla ice cream, which Dorothy herself calls a masculine dish.
Well, you can frolic in with a dessert when the time comes. Flaming bananas with vanilla ice cream. It's a decidedly masculine dish. You will enter like a victorious gladiator.
So that is what you will hear on Hear How to Prepare the Perfect Dinner Party. So this is the part of the podcast when I usually like to talk about record collecting tips. Well, this episode, I'm not really going to talk about tips per se, but my record collecting topic will be about something that I find kind of peculiar about the record collecting hobby. So listen on, my friends. In English grammar, there's a type of word or short phrase called a substantive. A substantive, or substantive noun, is an adjective being used as a noun. Basically, it's a short version of using an adjective plus the noun it modifies. I'll give you an example. Let's take the 1979 movie Quadrophenia. In that film, Jimmy and his mod friends take recreational drugs in the form of blue pills. But do they call them blue pills? No, they simply call them blues. That's an example of a substantive. Jimmy and his friends simply use the adjective as a slangy shorthand substantive. There are common substantives you may have heard in your life. You might have heard someone talk about a 10-speed to refer to a 10-speed bicycle, or maybe you've heard of someone of German descent being called a German instead of, say, a German person. In fact, substantives are used quite often in an offensive manner to refer to races, nationalities, immigration status. Maybe someone doing so is simply going through a low. Oh, low is a substantive for low point. Maybe going to watch a friendly in England will cheer that person up. A friendly being a substantive for friendly match, for example, in association football, or as we call it in America, soccer. Basically, an equivalent to an exhibition game is what a friendly is, as anybody who has watched Ted Lasso will tell you. The use of substantives happens with people who buy records and other musical media, and they don't realize it. Take the word cassette. By dictionary definition, the word cassette in and of itself refers to a cartridge meant for easy loading. A cassette can contain many different things, ranging from ammunition to bicycle gear systems to, of course, audio-visual media. If you go to a record store and ask where the cassettes are, chances are almost 100% that the staff at the store will understand perfectly that you specifically mean those tiny little 4-track tapes, side 1 on 2 of the tracks, side 2 on the other 2 tracks, with little reels, and they typically play back at 1 7/8 inches per second, and were very popular back in the 80s. If you're talking to a particularly pedantic staffer, you might be asked, well, do you mean audio cassettes or video cassettes? But whatever the case, you likely meant cassette tapes. In fact, they were so commonplace that if you simply walk up to any random person off the street and say, cassette, chances are that person will, first of all, wonder what kind of wacko just comes up to someone and says, cassette. And second of all, will immediately think of those tapes we used to play in our Walkman devices. If you're in a store that has a lot of specialty items and you want a cassette, you can't simply ask for, say, tapes, because there are different types of audio tape. Cassette, open reel, 8-track. By the way, 8-track cartridges technically are cassettes. And of course, play tape, the 4-track predecessor of the 8-track cartridge. But if you use the substantive of what you want and simply say 8-track or cassette or reel-to-reel, trust me, the shopkeep will know exactly what you want. But what about records? Well, records are made from all kinds of material. Most records, obviously, made from vinyl. Some are made of styrene. You'll find styrene singles probably more frequently than you'll find styrene albums. Older records that were played at 78 revolutions per minute on gramophones, those were made of shellac. Of course, most of us have encountered at least one flexi disc in our lives. In the previous episode, I talked about the one that McDonald's released, and many music magazines actually included flexi discs regularly with each issue. A Guitar Player, for example, did that a lot. Some of us have even encountered records that were pressed on the backs of cereal boxes. My wife, for example, has a couple from the Monkees and maybe the Jackson 5. There's even another kind of record that collectors who are fortunate enough to afford them love to have: acetate discs. They're usually test records made at studios with rough mixes. The Beatles, for one, often had acetate discs made of their day's work that they could take home and listen to, as was their habit before they got cassette players and would just record their music to cassettes. Acetate discs were typically not made of acetate, but aluminum and often coated with acetone. That acetone part might have led to the misnomer acetate to refer to these discs. Acetate discs are not made to last, and typically they'll be listenable for maybe 3 or 4 plays. And in case you're wondering, no, I do not personally have any acetate discs, or acetates, as they're commonly substantively called. So, it's perfectly acceptable to use the term cassettes when referring to cassette tapes, 8-tracks when referring to 8-track cartridges, although you probably still want to say cartridges when using 8-track because there are some reel-to-reel tapes that happen to have 8 tracks on them. But getting back to my point, it's also acceptable to say acetates when referring to acetate discs. But say vinyls when you're referring to vinyl records, some twit is going to say, they are not called vinyls. I don't understand what the big deal is. Vinyls is a substantive, just like cassettes, 8 tracks, acetates. It's also pretty clear that if someone uses the term vinyls, that person is referring to multiple records made of vinyl. That already tells you that the subject is not that old Spike Jones disc from your great-grandmother's shellac records. If someone simply says records, it could theoretically mean multiple records, one or more of which might be made from any one or more of vinyl, shellac, styrene, cardboard, plastic, or even X-rays. And yes, I am serious. There are some records from Soviet-era Russia that were made out of X-rays so that consumers could secretly trade banned Western music. Sometimes they're referred to as bone records. So why is vinyls such a cringeworthy word for gatekeeping record collectors? I can only guess it's a generational thing, given the age of those who commonly use the term vinyls. As a Gen Xer who is happy that there are those in younger generations being turned on to vinyl, I say, let them use the word vinyls. You know, tell you what, if you're so upset about people saying vinyls, then stop using words like cassettes, acetates, or even glasses when you're talking about those lenses that you put on your eyes so you can see better. Because, well, people who say vinyls will be happy to go to your store and use their plastic or give you some green. As a reminder to those of you who've heard earlier episodes of this podcast, and as an FYI to new listeners of this podcast, I'm going to tell you how I rate each record. I rate a record I talk about on a scale of 1 through 5 inclusive, each on 5 factors, meaning that each record will score between 5 and 25 points inclusive. First, I rate based on local interest or usefulness based on the contents of the record. I do take into account historical interest, that is the record an interesting sign of its time? And I also rate the records on their uniqueness, weirdness, and enjoyability. Now first, let's talk about local interest or usefulness. Since Hear How to Plan the Perfect Dinner Party isn't really specific to any locality, I will rank it based on how useful the record is, or at least how it might have been at the time it was released. Problem: Gaynor and Dorothy talk almost exclusively about the actual cooking, and I am not qualified to determine how useful it is because I hate cooking unless it involves a charcoal grill. I am fortunate enough, however, to have a wife who loves to cook and really studies up on food science and always looks for new ways to tweak the food. I admit it's a curse, though, being married to someone who loves to cook and cooks well, because it makes it hard to lose weight. However, I have turned it into an advantage. I showed Lisa the recipes on the back of the album cover and asked her what she thought. I know she has a lot of opinions on what passed for food in, say, the 70s and before, and, well, she did not disappoint. I'm going to emphasize that I only showed her the recipes that were printed on the album cover. There are a couple of more recipes actually in the spoken dialogue, but she did not listen to the record. But first off, we'll talk about Ruth Patterson's mac and cheese recipe. Lisa says the recipe looks legitimate, although she thinks the inclusion of American cheese is very strange. She also said that a mac and cheese recipe that calls for eggs and cream will probably end up with a pretty dense yield. The lobster tail recipe, in Lisa's words, sounds kind of good, but she cautioned that the prescribed cooking time might be a bit too much. You don't want to overcook lobster. But in case you don't have the album cover handy, the recipe calls for the lobster pieces to be sautéed for 2 minutes, turned, and then sautéed another 2 minutes before you remove them from the heat, and then the lobster gets boiled after being covered in tomato paste, allowing it to simmer for 5 more minutes. There's also a veal recipe. Now, Lisa never cooked or ate veal, so she can't assure a 100% accurate assessment of the recipe, but she knows it's a very tender meat with not a lot of fat, so you have to be careful not to overcook it. She also said the recipe has lots of things that sound 1960 fancy, as she says, like consommé. And she also said, and I quote, "It could be good, or it could be one of those things that people make for a fancy dinner, but they actually hate it in reality." Now, friends, I really wish I actually had recorded Lisa giving me her thoughts on these recipes, rather than just take notes. When she looked at the recipe for sesame-baked clams for the Polynesian dinner, she laughed very loudly and said, 1/4 cup canned bean sprouts? Do not ever! Fresh bean sprouts are 1,000,000 billion times better. But she did concede that in 1960, it was probably not easy to find fresh bean sprouts unless you lived near an Asian market. In fact, Dorothy and Gaynor do mention the possibility of finding the ingredients at a Chinese grocery store, but that any modern supermarket should have all the ingredients. Lisa also noticed that the recipe called for soya sauce and thought it was a typo, but no, even this guy talking right now who doesn't know a thing about cooking knows that soya is another way of saying soy. For what it's worth, Gaynor pronounces it as soy on the record. The recipe also calls for medium white sauce, which Lisa didn't know what to make of. She said, "I don't know what that is. Maybe cornstarch and water?" Lisa was amused at the listing of water chestnuts on the recipe. She says, and again I quote, "Asian and Polynesian recipes back then, they loved to put water chestnuts in. They were available everywhere." She was also amused by the inclusion of monosodium glutamate because, well, as she says, you don't see that in recipes anymore. Indeed, MSG has gotten a bit of a bad reputation of late, although no scientific data exists to support claims that it causes maladies such as headaches. As far as the scientific community is able to tell, if you're not allergic to MSG, you'll be okay. Lisa liked the call to cook clams in rock salt because apparently that's a very good cooking technique with a lot of things. What those other things are that are good to cook in rock salt, she didn't say, but apparently it's a good cooking practice. For the momi stuffing, the recipe says to use 3 slices of white bread. Lisa says, "You're never gonna see this recipe in actual Polynesia. This is what suburban housewives in Pennsylvania think is Polynesian." Her words, not mine. Do not shoot the messenger, please. Moving on to the chicken dinner menu, Lisa thinks it shouldn't take as long as the recipe says. Cook till the breasts are brown on all sides, about 20 minutes, and then another 15 minutes after the tarragon mixture is poured over it. She says the chicken might get overcooked, so it's probably best to check the internal temperature. 165 degrees Fahrenheit is what you're shooting for. Okay, I guess I knew that myself too. But the final step is to serve the chicken tarragon on toast, to which Lisa says that was something people thought was fancy for dinner back then, to serve everything on toast. One of the instructions for the bananas flambé recipe is to light the bananas on fire after pouring rum over them. Lisa said, "This was back before smoke alarms were common in households. Now you can buy a culinary torch for things like flambé and creme brulee to set something on fire to burn off the alcohol or to brown it." And she adds this observation. "There are safety considerations you need to take. Keep in mind in 1960, you probably had a whole can of Aquanet in your hair and you were likely smoking a cigarette, so you might be the one who ends up flaming." Overall, Lisa says the recipes aren't as bad as she expected, but they're still old-fashioned as they don't call for a lot of seasoning. As for the Polynesian dinner, she said, "Yeah, you can do much better. It's still not that great." So after getting Lisa's opinions on these recipes and finding that they're pretty legitimate but not really earth-shattering, I was about to give the usefulness rating of this record a 3 out of 5 until she brought up one good point that I hadn't thought of. It's actually a much better idea to get cooking tips and recipes from a book. It's hard to follow along with a record to cook, and even then, what was the likelihood that you had a record player in your kitchen? You'd have to listen to the record, take notes, and that wouldn't be very convenient. So because of that, I'm knocking the usefulness rating down to 2 out of 5. What about historical interest? There's so much about Hear How to Plan the Perfect Dinner Party that is essentially a snapshot of the early 60s, from the acceptable but bland recipes to some of the rather sexist comment in the dialogue.
Then you will help me with the party, won't you? You always tell me I mustn't work too hard when we give a dinner. You say you want me to greet the guests looking refreshed and bewitching.
You know I will, but I didn't say bewitching. I said lovely.
And to the story of the Carlton Record Corporation, and especially how it pioneered do-it-yourself audio. Also that the record label implies that this was originally supposed to be about being a party hostess, but the gender implication was eventually removed from the title, and that the women's liberation movement was just about starting up, kind of makes me think this record deserves a high historical rating. And finally, Gaynor and Dorothy Maddox were definitely highly respected food writers in their day, and this record is a good document of their place in the culinary world. I think I want to rate the album a 5 out of 5 for historical interest. Now, let's talk about uniqueness. I don't think records about cooking were necessarily unique, which kind of makes me want to give the rating a 3, but they weren't the most common thing in the world. And certainly a cooking record that has a rather amusing back and forth between the co-hosts wasn't exactly something that you'd find in a shelf of records in every home's hi-fi cabinet. So I'll bump up my uniqueness rating to 4 out of 5. How about weirdness? This, I admit, is a tough one. Nowadays, if you were to go into a record store and see this record, you'd find it kind of weird among, say, used Led Zeppelin albums, Paul McCartney reissues, and the latest from Lana Del Rey. It's certainly going to be amusing to happen across it. You'll find yourself thinking, somebody actually bought this thing at some point. When you get to the actual record itself, it's definitely unusual, especially that it's a 12-inch record made of polystyrene. Carlton's records of pop music were definitely pressed on vinyl, so I'm guessing styrene was a cheaper material, and since this was a spoken word record, it was safe to cheap out perhaps. Overall, this record is weird, but is it the weirdest thing in the world? No, but still weird enough that someone's wife will roll her eyes and maybe laugh if she saw you spending money on this. So, weirdness rating, 4 out of 5. Finally, the enjoyability rating. I'm going to come right out and say it. Hear How to Plan the Perfect Dinner Party definitely gets a 5 out of 5 from me. I listened to this record multiple times and was quite entertained by it. Remember in episode 3, I said that I wouldn't put an auto harp instruction record on for enjoyment? Well, even though this dinner party record is also an instructional record, it's a really fun listen, I'm serious, especially for its humor, for its intentional humor, and especially its unintentional humor.
Now for those tender little white breasts.
So to recap, I'm rating this record 2 for usefulness, 5 for historical interest, 4 for uniqueness, 4 for weirdness, and 5 for enjoyability, which gives Hear How to Plan the Perfect Dinner Party a total of 20 out of 25, making it so far my second highest rated record that I've reviewed in this podcast, placing it above Your Favorites by the Singing Johnson Family and below the J.J. Newberry Memorial Store opening record. I know that I've been saying this a lot in the few episodes that I've released of this podcast, but I really, really enjoyed doing this particular episode. Even though I couldn't find out a heck of a lot about the Maddoxes, Maddoxes? I don't know. I still found the research quite fascinating, and of course, listening to this artifact from 1960. I'm really looking forward into digging into more of the Carlton Hear How series in the future. But what are your thoughts on Hear How to Plan the Perfect Dinner Party? You can share your thoughts on this or anything else relevant to this podcast with me through various methods, of course. My email address is myweirdrecords@fab4it.com. Fab4it is spelled F as in Foxtrot, A as in Alpha, B as in Bravo, the number 4, and then I as in India, T as in Tango. My handle on Twitter, Blue Sky, and Instagram is myweirdrecords. I also have a YouTube channel at youtube.com/@myweirdrecords. And not only do I put the audio of the records I feature on that podcast channel, that is, if I can't find the audio on another YouTube channel, I also put this podcast itself on YouTube, which might especially be handy for those of you who listen via Google Podcasts, which will be going away soon if it's not already gone by the time you hear this. The website for this podcast, including the show notes for each episode, is myweirdrecords.fab4it.com. If you enjoy this podcast, please leave a review at Apple Podcasts, Good Pods, or whatever provider with which you listen. I owe many people great thanks, including Tim Christ for letting me use his record The Pac-Man EP as the basis for this podcast's artwork. Tim's comedic music can be found at worm-quartet.web.app, APP that is, and his latest album Carpe Tedium is now available. Also thanks to Kevin Zerb, who designed the artwork for this podcast. Kevin's music, podcasts, and other works are on the web at zerbinator.com. Special thanks to my wife Lisa for not only tolerating my habit of spending money on these strange records, but also for her valued input into this episode. Most of all, thanks to you for listening. For the next episode, due for release on May 15th, 2024, I haven't decided yet what record or records I will cover, but whatever I cover, it will fit in with the month of May, I can assure you that. Until then, this is Sean, reminding you to please support your local record store.
Now there is a man-sized bite.
And they even make comments that today could be considered pretty sexist. What happened to my voice there? Gee, it's going to be 50 this year, and I'm still going through puberty. Even sexist. Anyway.
Coffee, coffee, coffee.
Don't rush me.
He might have spent his formative years on the East Coast, but I couldn't help but burp.